Well, look, I mean, to review, for Berkeley's point of view, the phrase esse est percipi summarizes the whole thing. And to call attention to this again, note what he says in the last few lines about houses, mountains, and stuff. Note here, he adopts Locke's view that what the mind immediately is acquainted with or perceives is just its own ideas and sensations. And what do we perceive, Berkeley says? He says, what are the aforementioned items? Houses, rivers, but the objects we perceive by sense. And what do we perceive by sense besides our own ideas or sensations? Remember, the mind is never directly acquainted with an external world beyond the ideas or sensations. But for Berkeley, there isn't anything besides the ideas and sensations. See, he does not say we should be skeptical about the existence of a material world. Basically, what Berkeley says is we should deny the existence of a material world. So he says, what do we perceive besides our own ideas and sensations, and is it not plainly repugnant that any of these should exist unperceived? So see where he's going on this. It doesn't make any sense to say a pain exists without somebody there to be experiencing it, to feel the pain, right? So pain for him is just another idea or sensation, but so are all the qualities we perceive a supposed external object to have, like the blue color of that desk, the silver in the metal, the cool touch of the metal, the brown color or tan color of the top. All of those qualities of the desk are just perceptions in our mind. And on Berkeley's view, there's no material object that exists independently of our perceiving it that desk is. But it's God directly creating the immaterial idea in your own mind that you perceive. So for Berkeley, you can't cut God out of the picture like the materialists would want to cut God out of the picture and say there's only a material world. Hold on. Now, so then, whatever we call a material object is just, for Berkeley, a collection of immaterial ideas in the mind. And so essentially where Berkeley gets to that position, and we already saw this, is he agrees with Locke that the secondary properties are mind-dependent and subjective. That is, that in order for there to be a color, somebody needs to be around to experience color. The same with other secondary properties like sounds and smells and what have you. But then, as I say here, he provided additional arguments to try to show that primary properties are just as subjective and mind-dependent. And we saw this view is called idealism. It's the view that everything is of the nature of ideas. So idealism says everything that exists is mental. It either consists of minds, our mind, or God's mind, and the ideas are the perceptions of minds. So we looked at this before, but maybe quickly. Think about a dust mite, right? It's a little kind of reddish thing that you can barely see with the naked eye. The whole mite is about the size of a period, right? On a piece of paper at the end of a sentence. So the mite's foot is even smaller than that, right? So to us, the foot of a mite is extremely small. But from the mite's perspective, its foot is of ordinary size. And if there were germ on the mite, and they knew about one-celled organisms and microbes back then, the mite's foot would seem extremely large to the germ. Well, you wouldn't want to say, and as I said, if this seems like a really unusual example, think instead of a human being seen from the perspective of somebody flying away in an airplane and they're looking down at people on the ground, right? You get a mile or two in the air and those people on the ground aren't much larger than mites, but to them, they haven't changed size, right? And yet to you, they look like a dust mite. And so, get what this is. This is an argument that's very parallel to that water argument we saw for the secondary properties of heat and warmth and cold. The way we got out of the contradiction of saying the same pail of water is both hot and cold at the same time was to admit that heat and cold are not properties of the water, but they're subjective and in us as we experience the water. And this is what he's saying for size. There's no such thing as the size of something, but size is relative to a perceiver. I mean, take that table down there. I've sometimes seen basketball games from way up in the Civic Center. I used to go watch the Bullets when they were the Baltimore team. And there were tables like that table that were used for scorers and various things along the sidelines. And to somebody close to it, the table would look ordinary size. But to me, up in the nosebleed section, looking down at it, the table looks very small. And you say, well, what is the real size of the table? Well, both for Berkeley and Hume, there's no real answer to that. So size and other primary qualities were taken to be subjective and depended on a mind for their existence. So if there's nothing more to what we call a material object than that it's a combination of primary and secondary properties, and Locke showed the secondary properties are mind dependent, and now Berkeley comes along and says, oh yes, but I can give similar arguments, and this is what he does in 3 dialogues. I can give similar arguments to show that the primary properties are mind dependent, then the whole thing, the whole telephone, is dependent on a mind for its existence. But of course, God steps in and furnishes us with the ideas of things that are outside of the control of our will. All right. Now, and he says we can't even conceive of primary properties without secondary properties. We can't make the mental distinction between them. Berkeley says, try whether anyone can conceive of extension and motion, two primary properties of an object, without all other sensible qualities. Or another way people have said it is anything colored is also extended in space. In order for an object to have the secondary property of color, it needs to have the primary property of extension in space, right? So, again, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one around to perceive it, does it make a sound? Well, it seems like on Berkeley's view it does not, because there's no mind around. But fortunately, God is around to perceive the tree in the forest. And in your book is a little poem, and I don't have the book down here with me, but it goes something like this. It was written by a philosophy student in one of Bertrand Russell's classes in the early 1900s. And the poem goes like this. I think his name was Ronald Nash or something. There was a young man who said God must think it exceedingly odd if he, that is from his perspective, sees that if he sees that the tree continues to be when there's no one about in the quad. That is, if somebody saw the tree continue to exist, even with no mind to perceive it. But then the reply to that from Berkeley's perspective is, "Sir, your astonishment's odd. I'm always about in the quad. And that's why the tree will continue to be, since perceived by yours faithfully, God." So God is around in the forest when we're not. But it's an unusual view, and what's amusing to me is to see, or try to see, Berkeley defend this view as a view of common sense and as not a skeptical view. So color exists only in the mind, these other qualities do also. So the advantages of Berkeley's theory is we don't have the gap between the real world and the world we perceive. We do perceive the world directly, but the catch from Berkeley's philosophy is the world we perceive is mental. Now somebody, a guy named, whose last name was John Stone, was debating Berkeley once, and he walked over to a stone, I guess this was outside, and he kicked it. And he said, "Berkeley, I refute thee thus." And he kicks a hard stone. But is that a refutation of Berkeley? See, for Berkeley, there's no change in the world you and I experience, even though everything's mental. Because what are the properties of hardness in the stone? They're just sensations that need a mind to exist. What about the weight of the stone? That's just the sensation. And Berkeley says, on his view, if you cut the stone open, you wouldn't find that it's hollow. So, at any rate, so here's somebody who is in his right mind. He's not hallucinating. He's not smoking something strange. He, and yet he's advocating that there is no such thing as the material world, and that really falls out logically from the assumptions he has gotten from Locke and ultimately Descartes. The disadvantage is, though Berkeley claims his view agrees with common sense, it's not really so, right? We ordinarily think of physical objects as existing independently of minds. We believe when all of us go away, Wednesday or whenever you all leave for Thanksgiving holiday, and all these buildings are locked up and no one's around, we believe that these chairs and tables are still going to be in this room, existing as well as they're existing now. And it's not for us because they're being perceived by God, even if we believe in God, but because their nature is such that they are independently existing material objects in a world, that's real apart from its being perceived by a mind. So if things are just as we perceive them to be, I don't want to go into this other little wrinkle. If the world is as we perceive it, then how do we distinguish between true and false perceptual beliefs? How does Berkeley explain the illusion of the bent ruler in the beaker full of water? So that's all we're going to say there. I'm only going to touch on Hume because I think I want to make sure we have enough room for, besides review, for utilitarian moral theory. So I think wherever we are, we're probably going to go to that after the break. But David Hume was not interested in defending religion. We saw that when we saw Hume's criticisms of the divine, not divine, but the design argument for God. Berkeley said he's not a skeptic because he's not telling you to doubt of the existence of a material world. He's telling you straight off that there is none. He said a skeptic is somebody who doubts of things and withholds belief. Berkeley says, I want you to believe there is no such thing as a material world. But Hume saw Berkeley as a skeptic, and you don't need to write this down, but one of the things that Hume said in a later book is that Berkeley's views are only skeptical can be seen from this: that they admit of no refutation, his arguments, and produce no conviction. In other words, even if we don't know how to counter Berkeley's arguments, we are not inclined to buy into his conclusion that the material world does not exist. Right? Hume says the only thing they produce is the sort of momentary amazement that people get when they're first exposed to a skeptical argument. And this was Hume's idea too. Hume says, look, I have to behave like everybody else in the common affairs of life. In other words, Hume argued, for instance, that we cannot argue that the laws of nature are going to hold in the future the same way they did in the past. So in theory, it would mean that there's a possibility that the law of gravity is not going to always hold in the future like it does now. But that doesn't mean that David Hume would have been ready to walk out the third floor of this, or no, we're on the second, but suppose we're even higher. Suppose we were on the sixth floor. Even if David Hume argued that we should be skeptical about whether the laws of nature are going to hold in the future as they did the past, it doesn't mean that we're ready to challenge them by walking out a fifth floor window, for instance. Hume was a backgammon player. It was popular in Thomas Jefferson's day. If you tore Monticello, there's a very ornate wooden backgammon set there a piece of furniture that was not Jefferson's actual one, but he had one like that at Monticello, and he records in his journals, Jefferson does, when he lost or won some money playing backgammon for money against his buddies. So Hume says, look, here I am up in my study, and I'm writing all this skeptical philosophy, all these skeptical arguments that say we can't defend the existence of a material world. We can't defend the claim that our perceptions of what we think is a desk are actually caused in us by an external object versus being produced by the mind or some other cause. We can't, for Hume, defend our existence as a soul. Not only as a soul that might survive the death of the body. For Hume, you can't even defend the claim that you're the same person today as you were last week. Because Hume says, if I introspect into my own consciousness, into my own mind, I don't find any evidence observationally from introspecting into my own mind that that I have a soul that continues to exist. So for David Hume, what we experience are perceptions, and while Berkeley and Locke talked about all of these perceptions and used the word idea to refer to them, Hume says, no, I want to make a distinction between immediate sensations, like the sensation you get when you're looking at this yellow flower, the immediate sensation of yellow, which he calls an impression, a sense impression. And he says, we can look at this, but I can turn my head, and even if I don't look at the screen, I can close my eyes and picture what that yellow flower looked like. And Hume says that is what he calls an idea. It's a copy of a sensation, either in our memory or in our imagination. But he's an empiricist because he says to have a clear idea of something, we need to be able to trace it back to a previous sense impression. That is, if I defend the existence of the material world, I ought to be able to trace my experience beyond the perceptions to direct experience of a material world, which he says we cannot do. All we have present to us is perceptions, and we don't know whether they're caused by something beyond them, like Locke and Descartes believed, or whether it's just the perceptions. So Hume is not denying the existence of the material world. He's a skeptic, and what skeptics say is, let's just suspend our belief. Hume says, yeah, in my affairs in everyday life, I have to go about believing that I'm going to continue to be the same person, that I have to go about believing and acting as if the laws of nature are going to hold, and as if there's a real material world full of not only real objects, but of other people. But Hume says, I cannot defend any of these claims philosophically. So philosophically, I'm going to be a skeptic about it. But Hume says, okay, I'm up in my room, I'm by myself, I'm writing all this skeptical philosophy, all these skeptical arguments. But Hume says, when I go downstairs and I meet my friends for dinner and we play some backgammon and we have a good time, he says, I go back up and all these skeptical arguments seem so distant and cold and far from the truth. But he says, when I'm down there having dinner and playing backgammon with my friends, I have to behave like everybody else. That they're real people, they really exist in a real world full of real objects, that the backgammon set they're playing on is a real object. But he says, I can't defend any of this. His first book was called A Treatise of Human Nature. And what he says is, because of our human nature, we have to, and don't have much choice, we have to believe these things. But he says, if we think about these carefully philosophically, going from the assumption that our minds are only acquainted with our own inner perceptions, he says we can't justify philosophically the existence of any of this. So Descartes' project of trying to justify by reason all of our common sense beliefs, Hume gave various arguments to show that Descartes was wrong. So Hume's a skeptic. He says we don't have any impression of material substance as something that lies beyond our perceptions and causes them in our minds. So he says empirically, we can't logically get from I have a mental image of a briefcase to the claim there is a real briefcase that exists independently of me that's causing me to have those perceptions. He says, if I only have the perceptions, this is the point I made about Locke's indirect realism. Hume says I can't get beyond them. Locke speculates that there's a real world causing his perceptions that are beyond his ideas. Hume says there's no way I can experience that so-called real world directly and experience the necessary causal connection between that real world and my perceptions. So he says the only thing I can defend the existence of is my subjective perceptions. I can't defend the claim that there's an external material world beyond those perceptions that is causing those perceptions. Likewise, as I said, he says, okay, some philosophers like Descartes believe that they have a soul. Even Berkeley had problems with this, defending the existence of a soul. But he says we have a notion of it. Hume says no. He says when I look into what I call myself, all I stumble on is a bunch of fleeting experiences, perceptions. He says the mind is like a theater, and remember, they didn't have movie theaters then, because we're talking the late 1700s, but the mind is like a theater where all these fleeting perceptions and scenes come on stage and off stage. But Hume says, when I try to introspect in my own mind to find a continuous soul, a continuous self that continues the same and relates those perceptions, he says, I can't perceive one. I can't, by introspecting into my own mind. So he says, I can't defend the existence not only of an eternal, immortal, immaterial soul. He says, I can't even defend the existence, my own existence, as somebody who continues to be the same person through time. Hume also looks at cause and effect connections. He thinks Descartes, we saw this in the video, actually, I don't think I showed you the video on Empirical. Yes, I did. You saw the billiard balls, right? Descartes says, what do I actually experience? As an empiricist, if I think I have evidence for something, it has to come from what I directly experience. He says, suppose I see one billiard ball roll into another billiard ball. You know, the cue ball rolls into the 8 ball and sends the 8 ball running off. He says, what I experience is what he calls the contiguity of cause and effect, that the cue ball has to contact the 8 ball in order to get it to move. And I see the precedence in time of the cause. The cause comes before the effect, right? It has to roll into it before the other ball starts moving. But Hume says the claim is that there is a necessary connection between causes and their effects that enable us to say that there are regular laws of nature that operate universally, and the cue ball will always do the same thing to the 8 ball when it strikes it. But Hume says, where is the perception of this necessary connection that people are talking about? He says, I don't have it. All I see is the contiguity of cause and effect and the temporal precedence of the cause before the effect. But I don't see that necessary connection. So he says, I can't assume that induction from the past to the future, from how things have always been in the past, when we saw the cue ball contact the 8 ball, he says, I cannot infer that there are regular laws of nature and that the inference will work for the future. But you say, well, you could infer that if you bought in to, or brought into play, the observation that nature is uniform and predictable. But Hume would say, well, wait a second, that's what we're trying to prove by a probabilistic inductive argument that says the future will be like the past, therefore nature is uniform and is governed by universal scientific laws. But he says, in order to prove that inductively, you can't then bring in as one of your premises the claim that nature is uniform, because that's what you're supposed to be proving. And so he says, trying to claim that cause and effect will always work in the future the way it does in the past is an unjustified step in reasoning. So he says we should be skeptical about all of these. And I'm just going to quickly talk about what he says about induction is what I just said. Right. Inductive arguments go from they're probabilistic arguments. They're like arguments from analogy in that they're probabilistic, right? From all observed A's have been B's, all observed instances of a cue ball rolling into an 8-ball have caused the 8-ball to roll off in the past. Therefore, all future instances of that will be the same, or at least probably. But Hume says, this requires me to make an unjustified logical step. I can't go from all observed A's have been B's to all A's are B's, to the universal scientific law. I can't go from all water in the past has boiled at 100 degrees centigrade when observed to the claim that there are universal scientific laws that guarantee that all water at room temperature, at sea level, is going to boil at that temperature in the future. So Hume says inductive arguments don't work. The logical move made in these arguments is unjustified. Now, this is a different example about observing turtles, but I think it's just as easily seen. Again, we can't rescue ourselves by bringing in the assumption that nature is uniform so that we can depend on inductive arguments like all observed cases of the cue ball hitting the 8-ball have caused it to move in the past. Therefore, in the future, it will always be the same because nature is uniform. Because he says, how do we establish the claim that nature is uniform if it's not by an inductive argument that goes from observations about the past to concluding that it's always going to be the same in the future? So if you're trying, again, to prove that nature is uniform in that way, that these universal laws are holding now and will hold in the future, you're assuming what you're trying to prove by bringing in the premise of the uniformity of nature, and you beg the question, you commit a logical fallacy. So Hume says we can't rely on inductive arguments. So there's another PowerPoint that I sometimes, that's